fourth floor study carol at Davis Library at Carolina. I was there for orientation for my kids.
Trying to run me off.
Should be.
10 is about it.
We still have some feedback. Okay.
I hate that, 5 people are going to go home.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Free food. That's something. Well, that's good.
Are these on?
Can say.
I'm being ran into a little problem.
Did we get a line in? Yeah, that's good.
Good. Good. And Dr. Seiberg, would you call the roll, please?
Sure, and just as a quick reminder, just make sure that everybody that is speaking here in the main room speaks directly into the microphone so that the people that are listening remotely have an opportunity to hear everyone clearly. So let's take roll real quick. Dr. Bullock? Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Childers, sorry. Dr. Dempsey? Yeah. Dr. Fleming? Ms. Janeski? Ms. Godwin?
Here.
Dr. Graham? Here. Thank you. Ms. Hyatt?
Here.
Dr. Houston?
Here.
Dr. Jones?
Here.
Mr. Lockus? Dr. Locklear?
Here.
Ms. Loftus? Dr. Marr?
Here.
Dr. McIntyre?
Here.
You only have to say here once. You have a, there's a...
She's on. Dr. McIntyre, I think you're logged in twice.
She is.
Okay, Dr. Miller?
Here.
Dr. Weddington? Here. And Dr. Wood?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the August 9th, 2018 meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation programs. My name is Patrick Miller, and I'm the chair of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the State Board of Education meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Commission members, you have had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the August 9th, 2018 meeting?
So move.
Have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second to approve the agenda for today's meeting. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the agenda has been approved. Thank you. The minutes from our previous commission meeting on June 14th, 2018 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes? We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the meetings from our June 14th, 2018 meeting. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes have been approved. Also, the minutes from our previous commission meeting on June 28th, 2018 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
So moved.
Have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second to approve the minutes from the June 28, 2018 meeting. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes have been approved. Thank you. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Tim Drake, the Assistant Professor of Education Leadership and Policy at NC State University and the co-principal investigator for the Wallace Foundation grant-funded research University Principal Preparation Initiative. His presentation is a discussion item and focuses on the professional standards for educational leaders. Dr. Drake.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Pleasure to be with you all today. As Dr. Miller said, I want to come before you today to talk a little bit about the work we're engaged in under the Wallace Grant, where we are redesigning our principal preparation program. As part of that work, we have partnered with NCDPI to consider policies related to principal and school leadership preparation. You're good. So to give you a little bit background about the Wallace Initiative, the Wallace Foundation has been funding school leadership since 2006, and before that a little bit, but they've had 3 initiatives. The first one was a Principal Pipeline Initiative, where they had 6 school districts. Charlotte Meck was one of those school districts that were engaged in redesigning their principal pipelines. As part of that work, they realized that principal supervisors were important, and so in 2010, they started funding another round of funding for 6 school districts, or I think it might have ended up being 7 school districts related to the principal supervisor role. And then in engaging in that work, they realized that principal school leadership preparation was an important component as well. And so in 2015-16, we answered the call and became one of 7 universities that became part of their University Principal Preparation Initiative, where the 7 universities across the country were engaged in redesigning our principal preparation program. As an important component of that work, we partnered with the state, with NCDPI, as I said before, to consider the policies that relate to principal preparation. At the same time, in late 2015, 2016, the National Policy Board for Educational Administration began the work of revising or reconsidering the National Principal School Leader Standards. Those are called the Professional Standards for Educational Leadership. Still stuck. Okay. So to give you a little history, the ISLIC standards came out in 1996 as the first set of professional standards for school leaders. Those in 2008 were refreshed and updated with the ISLIC 2008 standards, as they were referred to. And our North Carolina state standards are based off of those 2008 school leader standards. That one, did they do it? Okay, yeah, I'm in slide 2. Yeah, keep going. Yep, next slide. So you can see kind of the progression here. So in 2015, the National Policy Board of Ed Administration, supported by many organizations, came out with the professional standards for educational leaders. So if you hit, you can see our standards were based on the 2008 ISLIC standards. And the question, I think, for us, and that I'm proposing to the committee today, if you hit one more, is should we consider updating our standards to reflect this latest iteration of standards? And I'll give my recommendation. So the 2008 ISLIC standards were good, but since 2008, we know a lot has changed. There's been new knowledge and understanding in both the research and practice side. There's been an evolution in leadership work. And of course, we know society has changed quite a bit since that time. So in doing that and considering how to update the standards, the following process was followed. They formed 2 separate committees. They had a research committee of experts that reviewed over 600 empirical studies. These studies were not limited to just school leadership, but they also included things like special education, English learners, mental health, social emotional learning. They really tried to be all-inclusive in terms of what they captured related to school leadership and the effects of school leaders. At the same time, they had a parallel committee that was run by a different group of practitioners where they interviewed over 1,000 current administrators and practitioners across the country to ask them, what do you think of the 2008 standards? What's changed and what might be needed for a new set of standards? Those committees then met and did a large crosswalk and reconciliation across the standards they independently developed. And that was put out for public comment twice. So there were 2 iterations where the public could give feedback. And finally, in the end of 2015, the PSEL standards were officially released, and there are 10 standards. Slide. So the PSEL Foundations, it has a strong evidence base. There's a evolved theory of leadership to student learning, which I'll show soon. The idea is really that they approached it from a systemic level and taking a systems perspective of leadership work. And they wanted these standards to not just reflect the job of the principal, for example, but also to include all school leaders, so moving from AP up through superintendent. So it's adaptable across roles and levels. And the big focus, and I think one of the most important things for us to consider in thinking about these new standards, was a central focus in this model on student learning. The language in these standards changed from being in 2008 ISLIC all students would be able to, and they went to the word each to identify, just to emphasize that point that each student is important. And they moved beyond the sort of narrow definitions that we had related to just academic success to try to target beyond that learning and development and child well-being. And they looked, again, how all areas of school leadership could trace back to students themselves. So on the next slide, you'll see their model. On the left, I know it's small, but the idea there in the center is student learning, and the 10 standards they came up with all inform and work to support student learning. They divided these 10 standards into 3 components: the drivers, standards 1, 2, 3, and 10. So that relates to mission, vision, and core values, standard 1, ethics and professional norms, standard 2, equity and cultural responsiveness, standard 3, and school improvement for standard 10. The core they have is related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment for standard 4, and community of care and support for students in standard 5. And then the supports, standard 6, professional capacity of school personnel, standard 7, professional community for teachers and staff, standard 8, meaningful engagement of families and community, and standard 9, operations and management. So under the Wallace work, we initially undertook the process of relating the PSEL standards and did a crosswalk to our NC State standards. You can see here that the PSEL standards, there are 10 primary standards, which I just went over, and there are 83 elements under those standards. So for example, standard 1, mission, vision, and core values, They have a statement under each standard. So that one is effective educational leaders develop, advocate, and enact a shared mission, vision, and core values of high quality education and academic success and well-being of each student. And then a substandard would be, for example, substandard A, develop an educational mission for the school to promote the academic success and well-being of each student. Under the current North Carolina school executive standards, we have 8 standards. There are 74 associated practices and 55 artifacts related to those standards. And then there are also 21 additional competencies associated with that. Again, these were based on and kind of grew out of the 2008 iteration of the national standards. And then below you see the standards alignment, how each of the PCEL standards relates back to the 7 or 8 North Carolina standards that we have. So I have to admit I'm a quantitative researcher. I'm not qualitative, but in doing this work, I did what I could, which was I coded each of the set of standards, the North Carolina state standards, as well as the PCEL standards by keywords that jumped out to me and seemed to be central to what each standard was getting at. And then in doing that work, I counted how many times those words appeared. And so here you have a bit of a gap analysis between what those code categories are, how they show up in the North Carolina standards versus the PCEL standards, and what that difference is. So on the left, you see the largest gaps in terms of what PCEL is, the PCEL standards are saying and emphasizing versus what we have in our state. So for the top one, you could see this idea of well-being is mentioned once in our school executive standards, and in the PCEL standards, it's mentioned 12 times. Again, part of the emphasis. You could see community and parents, vision, mission, goals, care, caring, culturally responsive practices, equity. These were really a central focus on the update, and so you can see that really comes out when we compare the two standards. If we look on the right, you see where the gaps are between what we have emphasized in our state standards versus the PCEL standards. The largest one being this idea of 21st century learning, which comes out, the artifact of evidence, which we know is a core part of our school executive standards, human resource leadership, which is one of the standards and kind of bubbles up, but is not included or is included only a few times in PCEL, and so on. So you can see where the gaps are and what we might, by considering this, these new standards, where we're strong and where we have differences. So my last slide. I approached the committee today as kind of part of this work, engaged in this work with NCDPI and with other school district partners, and thinking about, are we interested in forming a committee to update the North Carolina standards, or to consider updating the standards to align with PCEL? As part of this Wallace work, we have become part of a broader network that includes state and national experts that are willing to participate in both formal or informal roles in this committee, should we form one. That includes Jackie Wilson, who is the president of the National Policy Board of Ed Administration and helped develop these standards, as well as others that are interested in supporting this work, if we were interested. In engaging in this, I think just personally as a program, we have, in part of the redesign, aligned all of our program work. We're aligning to the PCEL standards and moving forward. And we feel like there are important elements in these standards that aren't as emphasized in our current state standards that we as a program would like our future school leaders to have. That's my presentation.
Thanks. Open the floor for discussion and/or questions for Dr. Drake.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I'm looking at this, the data chart that
Yep.
you have, Dr. Drake, if you want to go back to that, and I'm looking on the right side with the green, I want to make sure I'm reading that correctly.
Sure.
You highlighted a couple things that I'd made notes about. So the 3 columns there, tell me what those 3 columns.
Yeah, sorry, and I should have carried that over. So on the left would be how many times that phrase or an associated phrase showed up in the North Carolina standards. Right. So that's that NC codes. The second column would be how often that phrase shows up in the PCEL, and then the third is that difference. And so I highlighted green just being it's positive in the sense that North Carolina has it more often than PCEL.
So I think that would be one of my questions, would be a lot of it sounds like semantics to me with the language. Not that we shouldn't look at this, because I do believe we need to look at some other standards, but I'm looking at the things that are missing from the PCEL that are currently in ISLIC that we've spent a lot of time emphasizing because it aligns with our North Carolina educator evaluation system.
That's right.
As well. So that would mean, you know, not that it can't be done, but just putting that on the table, that we would need to redo that as well, right?
That's right.
Because those standards align perfectly and with our evaluation instrument, and we consider that a growth model. And it took us a long time in the state to really put an emphasis on the human resource development part of that, or leadership part, right? And the whole using evaluations as a growth model for our teachers, and then making sure our principals are held accountable for that, right? And you can do that. Most important thing we do in the building level is staff our building, but beyond safety, right? And we really focus on that standard for HR. So I guess my question, having said all that, would be, is there a way, and I'm sure there is, because we capture lots of things in the current instrument on different standards, but is there a way to, with the is it PESEL standards, to somehow incorporate more, you know, of what's on this side with the great things that are in the PESEL standards?
Absolutely, yeah. And so I'm so glad you highlighted that, and that's why I tried to provide both sides, because I think there's been two models. There have been states that have just wholeheartedly adopted these new standards, and then, as you said, evaluation processes follow, and all that kind of cascades through. But I think there are other states that are just thinking about, in lieu of these new standards, do ours need an update or a refresh? And so I think it would be the job of the committee to decide, to what extent do we want to sacrifice some of the great things we currently have, or maybe have been emphasized for so long? I don't think we would necessarily, right? It would be the committee's job, but then how could those integrate and align with the PESEL standards? Yeah.
So the other part of that would have been, in, you know, all of those, I know I emphasized obviously the HR component of that, but all of those things, you know, that we've really worked hard on, collaborative work with our PLCs and making sure our principals as instructional leaders are part of that. We would not want those kind of things to go away. I understand I could capture it under instruction and high standards, right? I understand that we could do that, but.
No, that's right, and it does show up in PESEL 5 times, so I think it's not absent, right? But yeah, there is a little more emphasis in our standards, by a word count at least. That's
Just
right.
to add to that discussion, Dr. Jones, I've spoken with Dr. Shirley Prince, who's Executive Director of North Carolina Principals and Assistant Principals Association. She is in favor of looking at the current standards for school executives, looking at PESEL and just adding the pieces in PESEL that are lacking in the school executive instrument. Now, that's not what we have to do. That's just what she talked to me about. And one of the things that she mentioned that I thought was spot on is that PESEL does a really good job of talking about equity and cultural responsive practices that's missing in our current, as well as the importance of wraparound services. And so rather than just throwing out the baby with the bathwater, just looking at what we have and what can we bring in to update.
Agreed.
So that's just a comment.
Yeah, I also feel like it aligns with the whole school, whole community, whole child model,
Right.
Which our board is really wanting to focus on. So I think that it would be good to add those elements that are missing that would support that model.
So I have a question about preparation, and so can you scroll back to where you've got the there it was. One more slide. Yeah. So here, okay. So one of the things that's happened, at least in teacher preparation, is we've moved from a number of artifacts, right, to fewer, more powerful pieces of evidence that link to preparation, right? So performance. And so when I look at this, and I'm not a school executive, I've not been one, I didn't go through school executive, but so when I look at that and I see 83 elements, and then I see this 8 standards, 74 practices, 55 artifacts, 21 competencies, that is super confusing for somebody who's not steeped in this world. And I'm curious about kind of the power of the artifacts and competencies and whether or not they're predictive of performance in any way versus having fewer that we could really concentrate on and then have better evidence linked to performance. So if you could just comment on that maybe.
Yeah, I think so. And I would also, the superintendents that are on the phone and in the room can maybe speak to that as well in terms of the evaluation role in using these. I do think, I'll say as a faculty member engaged in redesigning our program and trying to prepare school leaders, we have been a bit overwhelmed with the process of trying to touch on or address all of the standards, both at the state, NC standards, as well as the PESEL standards. I think we have higher leverage and standards that we like to emphasize, that we feel like a training program might be uniquely qualified to do. I think that at the national level, it's still moving through the process, but it's very soon they're going to have a release of the NELP standards, which relates to what educator preparation programs can do. Because obviously these PSEL are for all school executives. And so then they've backward mapped and said, well, what can we reasonably address within a preparation program? So that could also potentially fold into the work of a committee. But it does seem, again, from my point of view as well, just speaking personally, it is difficult. We feel like, and we all know this, principles matter. They matter a lot. And in asking them to do as much as we're asking them to do, it seems like we just keep adding to the job. But I'm interested, any others who've used this instrument or?
You just raised in your comments a point that caused me to have an idea. We look at the teacher evaluation instrument, and for career teachers, we have an abbreviated evaluation cycle where we just look at standards 1 and 4. But we don't have anything like that for principals or the other pieces. So perhaps if we form a committee to look at updating these standards to your point, which are the more important standards, and for principals who have reached a certain amount of service or number of years in the job, can we consider an abbreviated evaluation cycle for them as well? Just something to think about.
Is it time for a motion? Is there further?
To form a committee? Sure.
I have moved that we form a committee, and my concern is I know this is talking about leadership in a broad range of roles and titles that people may carry out. But there's a lot of discussion from disparate groups talking about the principalship. And I think it's going to get real confusing when one group has recommendations about the principal and another group has a different set of recommendations. It's going to come down to who owns the process. And I think it should be owned either by this committee or DPI or whoever, but it's time to take a look at that. And I'm not proposing a change, just that the committee be formed.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor to form a committee to look at whether or not we need to update the North Carolina standards for school executives. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion or additional questions?
Are you asking for a committee to determine whether we should have a committee? Is that basically what you're asking there?
No, we're going to form a committee to look at the standards and begin work to determine whether or not we need to update those.
Oh, to determine whether or not we need to update, okay.
Uh-huh.
That's fine, I just think that maybe that should then be the same committee that will update it, because hopefully this committee will determine.
That it is my intention that they will be one and the same. Sorry if I didn't make that clear.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So can we just make sure that at least a principal, Childress, or someone is on the committee while?
Absolutely. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, around the constitution of the committee, so my understanding, I guess, is that there'll be representation from this committee on that group, and then that group will consist of folks from the Department of Public Instruction, principal preparation programs, and then school leaders, principals, superintendents, and so on. So it will be the committee will be constituted of various stakeholders.
Yes, and I think we can probably pull something together and bring it back to the commission to look at before we move forward officially. Other questions or comments? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Okay, we will get to work on this.
Thank you.
Updating the standards. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Drake. We appreciate your time and expertise. Okay, moving right along, we will jump into NCDPI staff updates and discussion, and I will turn it over to Dr. Seiberg and Dr. Evans.
Good morning, everyone. The first item that I want to go over, a couple of these are pretty quick, and then the last one is somewhat more tedious. So I just wanted to give you an update. Since our last meeting, the board did end up passing the adjusted program approval process. And that, if you recall, was trying to make sense of a very laborious process we had in place prior. So we've made a more efficient process, long story short. That was passed. In addition to that, we've also made here at the department a conversion of the online system, which folks that have done the program approval process in the past are very familiar with that process. We've adjusted that online system so that the new requirements and the more efficient manner in which we do things is on that online system. We also, in addition to that, I'm having the two new programs that just got permission to operate as EPPs in North Carolina. One is Teachers of Tomorrow, and the second one is Charlotte Mecklenburg. They were granted permission to start as EPPs in North Carolina. We're having those two go through the online system and work out any technical bugs if there are any. I don't think there will be many, but they're in the process of submitting their program level approval into the system. And then as we go forward, once we get the feedback and do any touch-ups associated with those, the learning that we get from that process, then we will reach out to the various institutions. Part of 599 requires that everybody be up to speed and renewed as of 2020. And so we'll work to set up a system to stagger the IHEs and EPPs across the state between now and 2020 so that we have an even amount of distribution of those so that we don't have 50 programs happening in one semester, that kind of thing. So our goal would be to take some early adopters to go through that on a volunteer basis in the fall. And then sort of set up a staggered process going forward, just so that you know that that we're already in the process of leveraging that program approval process in meaningful ways. The second area is two items that we want to discuss. One I'm going to go through. They both have to do with licensure 001, the general licensure requirements. Just as a quick update, the residency model and the permit to teach additions were passed by the board, so that we have that additional language in there. As we all know, the residency model is really still needs some additional work, but we've made some strides to improve the language and policy associated with that. And then let me get Kim up here to talk about the school counselor and coursework credit hours real quick.
So for a school counselor, the coursework credit hours were changed from 18 to 24 semester hours, and those were approved by the state board. What I want to highlight is that that because LEAs were in the middle of hiring school counselors already based on that 18 credit hours, that Dr. Tom Tomberlin, he sent out on July 23rd to all the HR directors to let them know that on October 1st, that's when it would become active for the 24 credit hours. But 18 credit hours is active until October 1st.
All right, thank you. And the next item that I want to bring up is one of the more complex ones, which is this idea of the licensure exams and pass rates discussion. As we all know, there was 2 years ago, there was an adjustment in the process for beginning teachers to take a role in a school. Used to be that you had to pass all your tests prior to taking your employment. Then a couple years ago, they amended that to be you have to have at least tried to take the test and attempted it in the first year, and you have to have passed it in the second year. And in that process, there's a couple moving parts that I want to make sure everybody is aware of. One is that there was an adjustment back in 14-15, I think, to move to the Pearson tests. There were 3 tests for elementary educators. One has been particularly challenging in the field, which is the Pearson math test. And so Tom Tomberlin at last week's board meeting did a presentation to sort of walk through a couple of those points related to that test. And the reason that this is all coming to a head right now is because there is a group of folks that have not yet passed that test because they were in the have to have taken it once in the first year, passed in the second year. And they're now this summer at a point where they are, if they haven't passed it yet, they are in jeopardy of not being allowed to continue to operate as teachers in classrooms. And in some cases, they may be very effective teachers, just not particularly savvy with taking that test. And in some cases, we might even have EVOS data and various data within the system to actually, bring to light some of that conundrum. At the same time, there are certainly some folks who have taken and not been able to pass that test who may not be effective in the classroom. And so, as we all know, this commission came together to make an adjustment back in, was it end of June, beginning of July, to sort of head down that path, to sort of help some of that. And the long story short, that has led to an adjustment in policy to allow one more year on a permit to practice basis for those folks who have not yet passed, to have one more year to try and get that addressed. Another thing that Tom did in his presentation, and I think you have that in your attachments, is a PowerPoint, and that's from the board meeting last week. He wanted to go over some of the data that we've been able to collect and discuss some of the data we've not been able to collect regarding elementary licensure exams. One of the things that is we have evidence of is that since 2014 and 15, with the implementation of the Foundations of Mathematics Pearson test, we do see a precipitous decline in the pass rates from the implementation of that test, where it sort of hung in the mid-80s of pass rates. Then when we add the addition of this new test, we also add the complexity of attempt in the first, pass in the second. So there's a confluence of things happening that are causing or maybe pulling and pushing on this decline in this process. And so he sort of walked through that with the board. And his cautionary tale here is that, and I think it's important for everybody to know that even if we were to go to another test, regardless of the test, whether we maintain the existing test or if we choose to go to another test, we still have some problems tracking folks who have taken the test, because there are folks who have taken the test that didn't give the board or didn't give the Department of Public Instruction permission to look at the test results, right? So they haven't revealed those to us. So we don't have, there's some data missing for us to really make an accurate assessment of that. Now, the policies that we've changed to require that folks submit their test scores to us is going to help. And I think, from the field, I can imagine it, from the, having been a mentor and worked in the field for, many years, I could imagine folks who are taking the test that they are reluctant to reveal a low pass or a low score on that test to the department, because it might make them look bad, or, it's showing them in their best light. But just in a point of clarity from the department's position, they're just trying to get, to the point at which they have passed the test. It's a number for them. So whether somebody got a 0 on that test or was 1 away from the test is not the way the department looks at that. So we have to sort of break that mold within the field that, getting those data submitted to us is important. Also, if they submit later on, it actually costs them money to submit to the department later on. So anyway, we're navigating some of that. But I did want to draw your attention, again, there is a Pepsi subcommittee that has been thinking about this test and whether it is appropriate for measuring what we in North Carolina value in our elementary educators. And to that end, we've brought together a series of math experts to look at the current test as well as other test options. In that board meeting, Dr. Oxendine brought to our attention, in addition to whatever mechanisms and processes are in place, that we have. Sorry about that. That was Tom chiming in there. In addition to those processes that we're looking at in data associated with the test and possible new tests, she wanted to make sure that we did have the vendors develop and then us review with the math committee sort of a comparison to make sure that the current test is aligned with K-8 standards in North Carolina, as well as any new tests. You know, what is the alignment of any new test proposals, and what is the alignment of the existing test with North Carolina standards? And so that we've asked the vendors to start that process. Obviously, the vendors are going to say what they're going to say, but that's a starting point for us, and then we will bring that back to the math expert committee as well as the subcommittee to look at that to help inform whether they want to make any recommendations or decisions going forward. So I told the board that we would be working towards that end, you know, that we would have that information to this commission, and the commission could consider all the variables that we have to date and possibly have a recommendation in the coming months. Whether to stay with the existing test for a variety of reasons or whether to move to another test for a variety of reasons. And then ultimately, that subcommittee would elevate that to this commission to consider to go to the board, and then I would present that to the board going forward. So anyway, I just wanted to get you updated on sort of the process here. Because as I said, there are a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of folks that are vested in this. There have been there's been some reporting out in the news cycle through some video interviews as well as some articles online and in newspapers about this process. And again, the reason for that traction right now is because it has come to a head because these are folks that are potentially not able to pass and are in jeopardy of losing their job. We've postponed that process for 1 year, and they have a mechanism in place to make that a smooth process. And then as we go forward, we have this subcommittee that's working on that. And as soon as we get the two alignment studies toward the end of this month, we'll reconvene the math group, and then ultimately that subcommittee that had been working on that topic and get that. That'll be fast-tracked to try and get a solution as soon as we can.
So I would really like to comment if.
Okay.
Really push this.
Okay, very good.
What did she say?
She said she was in favor of fast-tracking.
Ask a question that's back at the top of your list.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a yes?
Could you ask the question again?
You mentioned at the very beginning, you talked about the Charlotte Mecklenburg and the other program that had been approved as EPPs, I think, Teach for Tomorrow.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about this is a process question, the relationship between that approval process by the board and the commission, and the relationship between that process and policy, such as the ones we're going to look at later? Where does that, given that that doesn't come before the commission, where does that connection happen? If those programs are meeting the policy expectations that come before the commission.
Right. So let me see if I can answer it, and if I'm going off track, just interrupt me and I'll go a different route. But if I understand your question, essentially the critical review of any new EPP that comes online is done at the institution EPP level, and then at the program level, that is an internal, that used to be a process where we had peer review and a lengthy process to go through that. We've streamlined that to an internal mechanism within the department to grant permission for the approval of programs within authorized EPPs. Now, to your question about those two new programs, they are subject, because they are EPPs, they are subject to the exact same expectations and accountability of any other EPP that's currently operating in North Carolina. So in terms of the expectations of pass rates, EdTPA, PPAT, all the different variables that go into an accountability model. And if you recall, we are actually building some of that as a part of the redesign in 599. The point is that any EPP that's been authorized will be subject to the same accountability across the board. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I mean, it answers in terms of process. Later, when we get down into the specific policies, not knowing sort of how that gap, the content, the information that's in that gap, just thinking about how EPPs obtain authorization. This is not a shot at CMS. I'm just using them as an example. In essence, Charlotte-Mecklenburg would have to be its own partner to be an EPP, because the authorization process as minimum standards requires partnerships.
Mm-hmm. So
the district would have to have a partner, and in the case of the other program, Teach for North, they would have to have evidence of partnership. And your explanation is those assurances are in the approval process.
Yes, they are in that approval process at the authorization level. Mm-hmm. But you do bring up a good point.
Though about partnerships, that's a really good point.
That is something we have not yet addressed, which is the notion of a district and the requirements for partnership essentially partnering with itself. That seems to be a bit of a challenge. That's something that has not come up yet.
A totally online entity that is not physically located in the state having partners. So that would, I guess the reason I'm asking my question is either it's undefined or I don't know what that definition is, but I'm sort of lost in both Ellen's point, how can you become your own partner? And in the second case, what is the structure for the partnerships that would allow that provider to get approval? It's a question that, maybe it is the absence of information that I'm struggling with, but I just want to make sure those, because it does say minimum standards in the policy we're going to look at later in the meeting.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll have to look into that as well. I think you're bringing up some points that maybe we can do some tweaking in policy to think about that. Because, again, this is in our first foray through this, we obviously didn't think about partnering with ourselves in that process. Yeah, and it's certainly something that we can elevate to the subcommittee, the EPP subcommittee, to think about as well. Thank you.
Dr. Seiberg,
yes.
I would like to talk a little bit more about Tom Tomberlin's presentation to the state board. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's critical that folks who are listening in understand that we've yet to find research that supports a correlation between the licensure exam and teacher effectiveness in the classroom. And having said that, you talked about the positive, there's some positive things going on out there and some negative things going on in the media about our teachers and being able to pass this exam. But the historical part of that was, teachers had a higher pass rate when they were passing already approved tests in Praxis 1, Praxis 2, whatever other tests were there. Then general statute added the requirement to take reading and math subtests. They did not add the requirement that they take the reading foundations and the math foundations tests that are given by Pearson's. Those two subtests that are in there can be captured under the Praxis 1, which was actually had a much higher pass rate. Districts are doing a really good job of using the North Carolina Educator evaluation system to keep effective teachers in the classroom and to help those that are not effective either grow or choose another line of work. And then when I say that, it's out there in the media sometimes that our teachers, because they can't pass a licensure exam, are ineffective, and we're keeping teachers who are not highly qualified in the classroom. Well, that's not true. Districts, that's saying that districts are not doing their jobs, that principals are not doing their jobs, and they are doing their jobs. And I would also point out that there's a huge teacher shortage in the United States. I don't know the exact numbers right now, but I can tell you today, Cabarrus County is, I do mine, Cabarrus County is sitting with 19, and we bring back our new teachers on Monday. Sunday before last, Charlotte Mecklenburg, it was reported in the paper that they had 450 teacher vacancies. I talked with someone in another county last Thursday, they had 125. And I know I chair the subcommittee for licensure, for the licensure part of that, and it really just appears that, you know, not casting anything anywhere, but we've got to do some things to remove the barriers for teachers to teach in the state of North Carolina. If they are highly qualified to teach children in another state and they're licensed in that state, we need to bring them here. If they complete a teacher prep program at NC State or UNC Charlotte or any of our private, Lenore Ryan, any of those universities, and they've, you know, the EPP is approved through North Carolina, that should be our litmus test for having a highly qualified teacher. And I know that you're not the maker of all these rules, but I do think it's important for this commission to make sure that our general, that the public out there understands that. Because you can't pass a licensure exam does not mean that you're not a highly effective teacher. And I know that you mentioned one of the, there is a video out there, and you can go out and Google that, I will just say. And it probably is the best example, and it's a veteran teacher in Charlotte Mecklenburg, a 19-year veteran who has mentored brand new teachers who are trying to pass this math foundations test. And in doing that, there's examples, calculus examples out there. And I taught middle school math, and so I understand. But when I look at that, it's not aligned. But even, I know we're looking at alignment, but what I think is critical to be on the table here is a licensure exam does not determine the effectiveness of our teachers or our administrators. And I know that was more of a sermon than a question.
I'd like to comment on that comment. I agree with all the major points. I also want to add that one of my faculty members, Luke Ranke, who is on the subcommittee to examine this test and to look for alternative tests and so on, he was interviewed yesterday by the Charlotte Observer and also made a video. And I think this is going to be pretty powerful. It should come out probably tomorrow. They're asking him actually to solve mathematics problems, and in doing so, do like a think aloud and talk about what is the mathematics elementary teachers really do need to know and what is really unnecessary. He's brilliant and a very strong mathematician, and is also really pushing for a different test, because his language is in this PowerPoint about the need for pedagogical content knowledge and not necessarily the content knowledge represented in that test. I think we're going to be moving in the right direction here. I don't think we're going to, this is going to change. There's too many forces that, and really smart people behind this. I think we're going to push this agenda.
This is Connie. I'd like to add to that statement as well. This is not only an issue for North Carolina. Teachers in Florida, Indiana, all over that have implemented this Pearson test. Their teachers are failing this test. My background is mathematics, and I understand the need initially for the change in the elementary and the paradigm shift with the standards. We also need to ensure that we protect the standards, but we also need teachers in the classroom. And we are losing so many teachers across North Carolina, but also, as I think it was Glenda that spoke earlier, across the nation. And there has to be a change. So this issue is just not impacting North Carolina. Teachers all over the nation that have, or states that have implemented this Pearson test, all the teachers are having many teachers are having trouble with passing this test. So I agree. I think this is a great change, and we really need to look at protecting teachers in the classroom. Not lowering standards by any means, but we have to change to meet the needs of our teachers.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, and I would just thank you all for the discussion, and just know that we have a subcommittee in play. We have a math group that is looking and will with the guidance of the additional information that the board would like to see voiced by Dr. Oxendine last week. We'll be providing the subcommittee and the math group that information so that they can make their best recommendation to the broader commission as soon as we can.
Web designers. Sorry, but I can afford a full-time staff.
I have a ton of stuff to get done around the house every day. Somebody talking?
Me too.
So when I was looking at the Charlotte Observer story with Luke Ranke is online right now. So I hope that you all look at it, and its title is "The Mathematics Test Too Difficult for Teachers."
Okay, thank you.
So I apologize, I didn't mean to start playing it, but it's there.
So I do want to ask one more thing, because I know we have a separate committee looking at the testing, but I'd also like for that committee to consider a recommendation that in the interim, because we can't end up in the same place next year, where we still have these same tests in place because we're still trying to figure out what licensure exam is going to be given. So is there not some consideration where we could look at if they take a test that's a Praxis 2, and or they take Praxis 1, Praxis 2, they've got EdTPA now, they've got PPAT, that we couldn't utilize those results, because all the general statute says is that they have to pass state approved exams. That's all it says. It doesn't spell out the exam. That's been chosen by people that are not in the field, the type of exam. And then when we're looking at comparability of exams from across state lines, we don't have anybody, to my knowledge, that's sitting here in a position qualified to look at those two different exams, an exam from Pennsylvania or an exam from North Carolina, and say, sorry, this is not the same test here. It doesn't have the same level of rigor. I will say in the field, our specialists are calling specialists here, and it's not the specialist here's fault. That's not their fault. But they're calling here, and they're being told that by folks at this level, and we don't have anybody qualified to do that. So I guess in all of that, I think there needs to be something put in place so we don't continue to lose teachers, and our teachers are not continuing to take a test that's not in alignment while we're studying it and while we're trying to get a recommendation before the state board. Because even if we have a recommendation by December to the state board, you still have the requirements in there that they're having to take this test this year. And these teachers, I want everybody to understand too, they had to go back to A0 pay level. So they had to go back and take a pay cut, and then they're having to make to apply for a permit to teach. So that's another barrier for a teacher that's making $35,000 a year to have to put that back on them to take it. And you have teachers who have taken this test 4 and 5 times, and they are very effective in the classroom. They just cannot pass the test. So we need some compromise.
So we will work towards that end.
Quickly, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's a little bit of an update on that side, and then we have one more update. Kim would like to get you up to speed with some of our online resources that are coming up.
I'd like to introduce the Pepsi webpage, which is actually projected right now. And what is on that webpage is an introduction to Pepsi, the membership, and also frequently asked questions, which also gives links to the agendas, how to be able to hear the live streaming for the meetings, and then also how to find the minutes. And I just wanted to let everyone know that it's housed within Educator preparation programs. So if you go to the DPI homepage, then under departments, there's the pull-down menu, and you choose Educator preparation programs, and that's where you'll be able to reach the Pepsi page. And so you can see it's about the 5th one down. But also within educator preparation programs, you'll be able to find EPP report cards, approved EPPs, NC EPP approval process and renewal information, and then the directory of the EPP personnel for DPI. And I'd like to give kudos to my coworker, Dr. Teresa Coogan, who's worked hard on putting this all together.
Is that it for updates? All right. Thank you, Dr. Seiberg and Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans, you're still up, and we'll introduce 2 policy action items.
The first policy action item is a new one called Eval 002, and the content for it is actually removed from the original LICN 001 because that had to be reduced. It was just so long. But this talks about in-field and out-of-field teaching assignments, and then also lets everyone know, especially LEAs, what non-professional licensing is, and lays that out as to what types of license those are. And then also talks about the notification to parents of professional qualifications of teachers for Title I schools.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Susan, I'm asking our chief licensure officer. So Susan, did you all look at this? Because, and I'm not sure if she's available to talk about it. When I asked the question is HQ designation went away with ESSA, right? And so I think part of our questions I received from the field was, could we not simplify this even more to say if the person doesn't hold a North Carolina license, then they're not considered HQ. I mean, I know we still need to talk a little bit about in-field and out-of-field, but could there not be some simplification with that?
We can look at it, Linda. I don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay.
That's something we'll look at then.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah.
So isn't the bigger question whether or not this policy is still applicable?
Yeah, well, it is.
Right? If ESSA is no longer the law and HQ is not in the new ESEA,
Right. Yes.
then does this policy need to exist? Now, maybe it does, I don't know, but I'm just wondering.
So that really is the bigger question. It was just if we felt like we really needed to keep it, could we not just, it could be simplified basically to a one-line kind of, but that's why I said I feel like licensure really needs to look at that in context of the in and out of field part of that.
Okay. That's something that will be done
That
next.
makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
So the second policy for action is TCED 009, and there was feedback from the field saying that it wasn't explicit enough, indicating that it's for initial teacher preparation programs. And so what was done was to edit the title and then to have a guiding sentence at the front, just to let everyone know that it was specifically for initial professional license, IPLs, and residency license, as well as being only for initial teacher prep.
So I have a comment there.
Sure.
So on page 3 and 4, where it talks about the GPA requirements and exemptions. So what I'm continuing to hear from the LEAs is we need the option and the flexibility there to be able to identify a 2.7 or greater on like a 24 semester hours. I mean, we need some other options there in the content area. So if they're to be admitted to, let's say, to a residency program or for alternative licensure there, can we look at that a little bit more and add that as an option? We've got the option there of looking at relevant experience and for career and technical education folks, but the big barrier there is going to continue to be, and some of the IHEs can maybe speak to that too, because could it be that they've got 24 hours in a content area and the GPA is 2.7 or higher, but their overall GPA is not? And there's a flow chart. I think you can still, some different options, and I think, again, Susan, you all may have a flow chart from the old way of having some different options in lateral entry, so that if somebody didn't meet the overall GPA, you could look at some other ways of getting there.
So
they
that
goofed off. They may have just goofed off and got an overall GPA of, 2.5. But if I look at 24 hours in the content in the content, they may have a 2.7. But I just think we need to have that flexibility.
So that's something that we can think about. But do you agree with the other changes? Okay.
All right, so are there other questions for Dr. Evans before I call for a vote? All right, do we have a motion to approve the suggested changes to that policy?
So moved.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second to approve the changes to TCED-009. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Policy has been approved. Thank you. And we're tabling eval 002, is that? For right now, okay. All right. So next, we will have a presentation from Dr. Kevin Bastian. He's the Associate Director of Education Policy Initiative at Carolina, EPIC, and Senior Research Associate at UNC Chapel Hill. His presentation is a discussion item on student teaching placement research and focuses on that and how placement sites can influence the careers of novice teachers. Dr. Bastian.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, today I want to talk about research that's sort of been brewing in a couple other places across the country, and starting here in North Carolina, really accessing and taking advantage of good partnerships with educator prep programs and the good data we have from K-12 schools. And so this starts with two broad questions that we've been really motivated to ask. And the first is, do characteristics of the student teaching placement site go on to predict the performance of early career teachers? So that is, do student teachers who student taught in certain types of schools or in certain types of classrooms or with certain types of clinical teachers go on to be more effective in their early career period? And then a sort of a complementary question to follow. Do similarities in the in-service and student teaching schools predict the performance of those same early career teachers? Where here the idea is student teachers gain familiarity, obviously, after being in a certain school that looks like school X, let's say. And if they go on to teach in a school that also looks like school X, does that help them in their early career period? There's a host of reasons why this really bubbled up. This is important. We're motivated to do this. It starts with anecdotal reports on the importance of student teaching. Since 2011-12, we've worked with Andrew and others here to administer a survey to all first-year teachers in the state, and it's about their educator preparation experiences. And those results clearly show teachers perceiving student teaching to be the most important preparation component they have. Then you get sort of this idea of scope. North Carolina sits within a national context where programs may need to place nearly 150,000 candidates each year. That number's gone down some in recent years, but if you start to think about that, that's a lot of placements that need to be secured every school year. There's some equity motivations here with the idea that research would show that early career teachers are going to be going into schools serving higher percentages of low-income and minority students, which means if we can use student teaching as a mechanism to improve their performance, then that's going to benefit those kids, of course. And then, part of this work is sort of broadly testing theories or arguments, right? One school of thought would suggest that if early career teachers are going into challenging work environments, then they should student teach in those environments and they'll be better prepared for that. The other side of that coin is, no, student teaching is an apprenticeship, and you should apprentice in a good learning environment. And so that's one thing we're trying to test. And then lastly, this idea, which gets at this idea of familiarity or similarity between schools. The opportunity to acquire job-specific human capital. Again, if you've student taught in a school that is high-performing or low-performing or has high concentrations of economically disadvantaged students, you maybe been better prepared to work in those environments a few months later when you're hired, right? So those are some of the things that we're testing and sort of why. I think it's clear, and from our perspective, there's a couple sort of implications, both from a policy and practice perspective, and perhaps the practice implications are more readily apparent. But certainly, states like North Carolina have regulations regarding student teaching, its structure, how long it's supposed to be, what are the requirements of the clinical teacher, etc. And there's also regulations around the relationships between educator prep programs and school districts. And those sort of seamlessly merge into sort of those more practice implications. Outside of policy, there's still areas for educator prep programs and school districts to operate in better placing student teaching candidates. And I think, as this work will show, hopefully motivating educator prep programs and school districts to be forming closer partnerships to facilitate this work. So who are we studying? We have reached out and received student teaching placement data from 6 UNC system institutions over a 5-year period. So that's their student teachers in 11-12 through 15-16. Those individuals comprise approximately 70% of the initially prepared teachers in the UNC system. And those 6 institutions are spread geographically across the state from east to west. Essentially, what they're giving us is an identifier for the student teacher, when he or she student taught, like fall 2014, spring 2015, right? The LEA school code where they student taught, and the name of the clinical teacher. And we're able to take that and then connect it to administrative data from NCDPI to know characteristics of the student teaching placement school, the placement classroom, and the clinical teacher. And then eventually follow that student teacher into the field to see how those characteristics actually influence their performance. So this is a table that shows basically the characteristics that were about the student teaching placement site that we're linking to each student teacher, who then again becomes an early career teacher in the state. So in terms of the placement school characteristics, we can know its urbanicity status, city, suburb, town, rural. We can know the percentage of ethnic and racial minority students and economically disadvantaged students. We can know the school's short-term suspension rates, teacher retention rates. We've used the TWC to create a measure of teacher collaboration at the school, with prior work showing that that is an indicator of a good learning environment, and novice teachers benefit from that. And the EVOS growth status. By virtue of knowing the clinical teacher, we can know the students he or she taught, and sort of by extension, that's the students that the student teacher was interacting with as well during their student teaching experience. And so for those students in aggregate, we can know like the average days absent. Again, other demographic information like minorities, economic disadvantage, what percent was mobile, moving across schools, EC, gifted, limited English proficient. And then we can leverage personnel data from DPI to know a lot about the demographics, the credentials, and the prior performance of that CT, of the clinical teacher. So we can know, for instance, their prior year EVOS estimates, their prior year evaluation ratings. We can know whether they were nationally board certified, how many years they've taught, their licensure exam scores, things like that. And so I just want to give you a flavor for what some of the descriptives look like. And in conversations with our partners at these institutions, it was always clear that the descriptors are not the results, right? They're not the analyses we're performing, but they're always very beneficial for an EPP to sort of see, well, in aggregate, where are we really placing our candidates? And these are some select placement school characteristics. I think the easiest thing to do very quickly is to go, and give an example. So Educator Prep Program 4 there at the top, on average, they were putting their candidates over this 5-year period in student teaching schools where half the kids were a racial or ethnic minority. A little less than 40% were economically disadvantaged. Nearly 83% of the teachers were returning. Their standardized, their teacher collaboration measure that we created was slightly above the mean. They were going into schools where over 55% of them had exceeded growth, and only 15% didn't meet growth. So that gives you a sense of sort of what these data mean, and you can definitely see variation across the Educator Prep programs, which I think, as you would appreciate, is driven, I think, both by unique aspects of an EPP, its vision, its mission, who it serves, and geography. Where they're located in the state, and what are the K-12 schools around it. Obviously, is going to influence greatly these placement school characteristics. You see the same thing here for some select clinical teacher descriptives. Again, it might be valuable to just pick one as an example. So EPP2 in our data, their student teachers were matched to clinical teachers. 8% of those clinical teachers were a racial or ethnic minority. Those clinical teachers had taught on average for 15 years. Over a quarter of them were nationally board certified. Almost 3/4 had been prepared in North Carolina. Nearly half had actually been prepared by that Educator Prep program. And on average, their prior year evaluation ratings were just below accomplished, if accomplished is a 4 on the rating scale here. And their prior year EVOS estimates were about 17% of a standard deviation above the mean, so slightly above average. And again, just like with the school characteristics, you'll certainly appreciate there's variation in the clinical teacher characteristics for each EPP or across EPPs. So when we think about how do these student teaching characteristics relate to the performance of those student teachers as they move into the workforce, we look at 2 outcomes. Teachers' standardized EVOS estimates, so a measure of value added to student achievement, and a composite evaluation rating. We ran models for each of the 5 teaching standards, but in this case, what we're showing and what we typically show are models where we've summed the ratings across the 5 standards and then simply have that as a standardized measure. Our models are on teachers in their first 3 years, although we do have additional models on just first-year teachers. We're comparing within graduates of the same institution. So that's a university fixed effect. The idea there is we can sort of control for the fact that institutions serve particular areas, have particular missions, particular coursework, and by comparing within institutions, you sort of net that out. And you can just try to isolate what it was about differences in student teaching and placements that might predict outcomes. So what we're looking at here are placement school results. So the relationships between characteristics of the student teaching school and the future performance, if you will, of that student teacher as an early career teacher. The bars in gray throughout this are for the composite evaluation rating, and the black bars there you see are for the EVOS value-added estimates. I think perhaps 3 key takeaways. First, having to do with teacher collaboration. So early career teachers who student taught in a school where the teachers at that school were reporting more levels of collaboration, they go on to have slightly higher evaluation ratings and EVOS estimates. And an interesting thing there is we got some great advice from a faculty partner at one of our institutions who wondered whether if you ran these models looking at the candidate's GPA, like does it matter more if the candidate was a low GPA, middle GPA, high GPA? And we actually see some really robust results where the lowest GPA candidates at these institutions were particularly benefiting from going into an environment with richer, if you will, teacher collaboration. Secondly, we see that relative to early career teachers whose student taught in a school that did not meet growth, early career teachers whose student taught in a school that exceeded growth have higher EVOS estimates in their early career period. And actually, in a model limited to just first-year teachers, not first, second, and third-year teachers, the results are actually positive both for exceeds and meets growth. This is also somewhat consistent with prior work and the idea of going into a school that's producing student achievement growth as being a beneficial thing. And lastly, we see some results related to student demographics there at the top. Early career teachers have higher EVOS estimates when there was a higher percentage of racial or ethnic minority students at the student teaching school. But conversely, slightly lower EVOS estimates when there was a higher percentage of economically disadvantaged kids. So what's really unique about some of our work compared to a little bit of work that's done elsewhere, and we are able to leverage roster data in North Carolina to do this, is we can really know characteristics of the actual kids those student teachers were interacting with in those classrooms. And so what we see here is some similar results carrying over from the placement school slide that we previously saw, by which I mean we see some positive results for early career teachers who student taught now in classrooms with more racial and ethnic minority kids. And again, sort of slightly negative results for those early career teachers who student taught in classrooms with more economically disadvantaged students. And I think the other big takeaway here is for the evaluation rating, the composite evaluation rating we created, you see positive, not too large, but positive results for student characteristics that you might interpret to be more challenging, by which I mean we see positive results when students averaged more days absent, when there was more student mobility, when there was a higher percentage of EC kids in that classroom. So that's sort of a theme you see there clearly just with the evaluation ratings. And so now to the clinical teacher side. And we sort of can break up those, like I said, those clinical teachers' characteristics into sort of three buckets. One is demographics about that clinical teacher. The second would be their credentials, and the last would be measures of their prior performance. When it comes to the demographics, what we were really interested in is not the clinical teacher's gender and race ethnicity sort of in a vacuum, but how that might interact with, in particular, the race ethnicity of the candidate. So relative to white candidates placed with white clinical teachers, you can see different sort of possible combinations there. And the one that stands out as having a negative and significant result is minority candidates or student teachers placed with a white clinical teacher go on to have slightly lower evaluation ratings early in their career. When it comes to credentials, we see that experienced clinical teachers, that predicts higher EVOS estimates for early career teachers. And we also see that early career teachers, when they had a clinical teacher who scored higher on their own licensure exams, and when they had a clinical teacher that actually came from the same EPP, they earn higher evaluation ratings. And that same EPP result, certainly could be due to sort of social networks, other sort of mechanisms like that. It could be due to the fact that CT was more aware of sort of the practices of that EPP, the way they structure their program, what they emphasize, etc. Lastly, turning.
Can I interrupt for a minute? And just go back to the demographics of the teachers. Why is black candidate and black clinical teacher different from minority candidate and minority clinical teacher? What's the difference?
Thanks, Helen.
Like in any minority or?
Yep. Nope. Thank you. That's a good clarifying question. We explicitly, given prior research, and given that most of the most of the minorities from the candidate side or the CT side are black. We wanted to pull that out separately. So black candidate and black clinical teacher is distinct from minority candidate with minority clinical teacher. They're exclusive categories, if that makes sense. Because we
The other minorities are everyone else? Is that what you're saying?
yes. So like minority candidate with minority clinical teacher, that could be a black candidate, but not with a black clinical teacher, for instance. The idea there was to really isolate that particular match, given it makes up, again, given that black candidates and black CTs are by far the largest sort of minorities in the data.
Well, okay, but those numbers don't make any sense to me. Maybe you'll explain that. Go ahead.
Well, probe ahead. I'm happy to talk about it more. In what sense? In what sense would you want sort of to talk about it more?
Well, minority candidate, minority clinical teacher, the EVOS estimates -15. You know, and then like black candidate, black clinical teacher, +5.
So these are percents of a standard deviation in EVOS estimates. You know, the -15 is big. It's not significant because there's not very many people who are falling into this group of you know, having a minority clinical teacher and a minority candidate that didn't fall into that black and black match. But yes, this is saying relative to white candidates placed with white clinical teachers, you know, there's certainly some evidence of minority candidates placed with minority clinical teachers having lower EVOS data. That this isn't necessarily causal. It's not necessary. You know, I wouldn't sit here and say that's a causal relationship so much as other factors going on.
Okay. So, well, the only significant one is the minority candidate and white clinical teacher, but we can probably guess some reasons for that as well. Okay, thank you.
And then you can see, in terms of clinical teacher prior performance, you know, theory and research would sort of suggest that clinical teachers have two key competencies that may be really valuable for the student teacher. One would be that clinical teacher's own instructional proficiency, if you will. They're a model of high quality instruction. The second would be that clinical teacher's ability to serve as a coach, a mentor, someone who helps an adult, in this case, a 22-year-old student teacher, learn. And we see some evidence that would suggest that both of those competencies are important. By which I mean, for instance, if you look in the EVOS column, we see that early career teachers who had a clinical teacher who had higher prior EVOS estimates, they go on to have higher EVOS estimates themselves. When you think about evaluation ratings, we see that early career teachers whose clinical teacher was rated higher on the leadership standard in North Carolina, which is not a perfect proxy for mentoring or coaching, but does have indicators for working with colleagues and mentoring. You see that those early career teachers go on to have higher evaluation ratings early in their career. So again, some suggestion that both of those competencies, and I would say work in other states right now that's kind of basically happening at the same time as this, is also saying that both of those competencies for the clinical teacher matter. Empirically, they're able to show that. So our data window sits before the state made some changes to require that the clinical teacher is at least accomplished on all the evaluation standards. Nonetheless, we thought it'd be an interesting sort of experiment to carry forth an idea to just see, do early career teachers have higher evaluation ratings or value-added estimates when their CT meets accomplished on the evaluation standards. So we don't see any positive and significant results for EVOS, but we do in fact see that early career teachers, when they were matched or assigned to a CT that was at least accomplished, or either accomplished or distinguished on all of the standards, they go on to have higher evaluation ratings in their first 3 years. So this is sort of the shift then from that first question that was really about the placement site characteristics and early career teachers to thinking about similarities between the student teaching school and the in-service school. And this slide is just a nice sort of descriptive setup to show that what I think we all appreciate, labor markets for a lot of things, especially teachers, are local. So what this is showing, the gray bar is the percent of student teachers whose first job is in the same school they student taught in. And the black bar, the same district but a different school. And so you could sum the two to get the percentage that were hired within the same school district. On average, across the about 8,000 candidates in the data here, that average is just a few percentage points below 50%. It ranges program per program from 37% or so for the last EPP, EP6 there on the far right, to nearly 60% for EPP3. So I can, I'll touch on this again later, but the idea here is clearly that school districts have a very practical and joint interest in what's going on here, because the candidates placed in these districts today are quite frequently going to be district employees sort of tomorrow, so to speak. So I think this is perhaps certainly our largest finding in terms of magnitude, and perhaps a very practically significant one. We ran models to see whether those who student taught, those who are working in the same school they student taught in are more effective. And there's sort of two reasons why we might expect this to be the case. The first would just be that student teaching is a year-long job interview. A principal gets to observe that candidate for 9 months. They should know whether that candidate's good and wants to hire them or not. The second sort of mechanism that could be in play here is this idea of job-specific human capital I talked about earlier. If you're a candidate and you've spent 9 months knowing about these kids, your colleagues, your administrators, curriculum, school policies, you should be better set up to succeed in that school than hypothetically another school. And so what we find quite clearly is that early career teachers are more effective when they're working in the same school they student taught in, both based on evaluation ratings and EVOS. Now, we wanted to try to tease apart those two mechanisms. Is it just that effective schools in some sense recognize talent and are able to sort of gobble it up, and it has little to do with sort of job-specific human capital, or is it both? And what I can say there is, again, we ran those models by GPA, and we can show that the candidates with the lowest GPAs and the lowest quartile GPA for their institutions, still we see positive results here. So it's not as if the positive results are accruing to those with high GPAs, if that's sort of an indicator of quality at least. And we ran some other models comparing teachers just within the same buildings who did or did not student teach there. And we also see these same positive results that are essentially unchanged. So I think that would suggest that sort of both mechanisms are in play. I think that has some real practical significance for school principals and school districts.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
So I'm curious if you have enough data to look at something like, so I'm looking at the data up here where it talks about so schools that exceed growth, right? The teacher candidate then goes on to be pretty successful, it looks like. So within this context, if I take a student teacher and they are in a school that does not meet, right, what do they look like, right? So if I student teach someone in a school that exceeds growth, but then they go on to work in a school that doesn't meet growth, is there a relate? My question's kind of cumbersome, I think.
We did it. I know what you're talking about. We did it a little bit, but with performance composite, not growth. But there could be reasons to certainly do it with growth. And I'll touch on it in a second. But I think that's a perfect question, and that sets it up well, even for the next slide. This idea of similarity. I guess you have the most similarity when you student teach in the same school, right? But that only happens in some cases. And what we wanted to look at more broadly is just a set of school characteristics. And again, Michael, we looked at performance composite, percent economically disadvantaged, and racial and ethnic minority. Although, again, we could use an EVOS growth score or the growth levels as a way to do this too. What this is showing, and I think we can just pick one as an example because it's parallel to the others. So if you could take took performance composite at the top, the first row shows the absolute value difference in the performance composites of the student teaching school and the in-service school. So sort of on average, if you looked at those values, there's basically a 16-ish percentage point difference in the performance composite of the in-service versus the student teaching school. Now, this is an absolute value because, of course, that could go either direction. You could have an in-service school that has a lower or a higher performance composite, right? Although we see, if you look at that sort of third row there, like for instance for EPP5, just to give a very clear example, 25.54% of EPP5's student teachers who get a job go into schools where the in-service school is one or more standard deviations lower in performance composite than the student teaching school. And for each of those, I guess contrast that with only 9.21% of their candidates are getting jobs in schools that have, where the in-service school is more than one standard deviation higher on the performance composite. So this sort of makes sense in a sense that a higher percentage of the candidates are getting jobs in schools that are lower performing versus where they student taught. And so extending that, Michael, we ran models, and we can jump at one. We ran models to see how an absolute value difference in the performance composite, which is at the top, or economically disadvantaged in the middle, or racial and ethnic minority, which is the bottom set of bars, predicts the performance in those early career teachers. And what we see, these are all the results are negative. Most of them are statistically significant. They're not incredibly large in magnitude, but they show that dissimilarity, if you will, is problematic. So as the absolute value difference becomes larger between the student teaching school and the in-service school and these characteristics, the early career teacher is slightly less effective. It's particularly problematic, and the result is large, for those candidates who get jobs in schools with much lower performance composites. The EVOS result is about 18% of a standard deviation. It's probably the largest single estimate we have in the data. So again, performance composite isn't growth, but it gets a little bit at your question of the idea of,
and that's what I'm interested in. Right?
Yep.
Is how they're impacted if they're high-performing student teaching placement, but then they work in a lower performance.
Which is perhaps particularly relevant to where NC State might be placing candidates in their student teaching in Wake County, et cetera. Okay, thank you. So I think there's a few key takeaways here, and then happy to chat about this and answer questions. Going back to that idea of, should you have a student teaching experience in a really challenging environment to better prepare you, or a high quality learning environment? And those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive things, of course. But I would say our evidence, plus some evidence on a couple other studies elsewhere, would suggest that high quality learning environments do matter. We certainly see that candidates are influenced by both the instructional and perhaps the mentoring or coaching skills of that clinical teacher, which makes sense. But it's nice to empirically show that in data. Some potential benefits to more diverse student teaching placements. We saw there with the results for both the placement school and the placement classroom. Again, descriptively, I think a very impactful result is just this idea that a really meaningful percentage of teachers are being hired by the same district in which they student taught. And I think there's, from an alignment and HR perspective and an induction perspective, so many things, there's connections between the EPP and the early career period that fleshes out. And then lastly, evidence that similarity in environments, particularly when you're teaching in the same school, is beneficial. And I just want to thank really quickly the 6 UNC system institutions who both provided their data and on multiple occasions were helping us talk about it, think about the results, etc. This NCDPI for providing K-12 data to make this all possible, and the Belk Foundation, who also made this possible by funding this research. So thank you very much. I look forward to talking about this.
Okay, questions?
Yeah, I have one more question. On slide 12, so it looks like one of the strongest indicators there is years of experience.
Mhm.
So clinical teachers with 6 or more years experience tends to be.
So relative to early career teachers who had a CT who was
year 5, 4.
Yeah,
right, when they're just
eligible,
right
just basically just eligible for it. Yes.
Yeah.
Those who had a CT with more experience go on to be have higher EVOS estimates by about 10% of a standard deviation.
And I think I'm correct in that our teaching force tends to be somewhat bimodal in that we have large proportions of teachers in their first 3 years, large proportions in years 25 plus, and very few in this band.
About 25% of the workforce has less than 5 years of experience.
Okay.
About 50% of the principal workforce, for instance, is less than 5. So it's the workforce in North Carolina, like a lot of places, is sort of greened in the idea that they're more novice, but it's been that way for quite some time.
So not necessarily a question, but just more of a comment. So, you know, great data to reflect on. I think one of the things that, you know, again, jumps out at me is the fact that with the student teacher placement, not every district in the state is close enough to a university that has a teacher prep program. So that does dictate placement of student teachers. So you have a lot of your more, and we're fortunate in Concord and Cabarrus County because we do have one within our region. But I think when we're looking at studies like that, that has to be taken into consideration. The fact that, you know, if I'm at NC State, I'm going to be placed for student teaching in Wake County. I'm not necessarily coming over to Cabarrus, but nor am I going down to the eastern part of the state to a rural area. And then as Michael pointed out, the other part of that is just the veteran status, right? The new versus our veteran teachers and having that qualified clinical teacher to work with our student teachers.
And there could sort of be a needs analysis or something that could be done, you know, given policy on sort of what a CT has to be. They have to be X years of experience. They have to be at least accomplished, right? They have to, if they have EVOS data, it has to be at least met growth. You can picture schools where there's many teachers who qualify and schools where there's not. And that's the other part of it too. EPPs are located in different places with different school and CT characteristics. So it's all sort of you know, in fairness, it's all a bit of a complicated dance. Yes. But a sort of an outsider's perspective is there are ways to sort of form better connections, better leverage a relationship between an EPP and a school district to improve placements. Again, to think about sort of that whole continuum of preparation through induction, early career period, that I think this work and other works, you know, exemplifies.
Yeah, I think it's great data. It's very, you know, for an EPP to be able to look at this and bring it to their faculty and their programs and talk about where students, because I think, you know, in a lot of instances we have a sense of where our students are going, but then to actually see it, because we as EPPs don't have performance data, right? That's not part of what we get. So when an EPP makes a placement for a student teacher, we're relying on the building leader to certify that cooperating teacher has met the state requirements and has met a growth standard or performance standard. You know, we're not engaged in kind of personnel, right?
And I think there's an implicit assumption that when that school principal is doing that he or she may be more likely thinking about CTs who might be good on instructional skills, which again we show is important, but I think sometimes might be left behind is the ability of that CT to really mentor and coach and work with that adult learner to produce, you know, their own growth over that 9-month period.
We also, I think it's, you know, the case also that we ask a lot of these folks that we're, these 6 to 10 plus, the folks that we as EPPs are really trying to have as cooperating teachers, often we're asking, districts are also asking those same folks to engage in kind of leadership positions within their school, right? So they're department chairs or they're BT coordinators or they're mentoring, and so you've got this real challenge, I think, when we're trying to do this. So I think the reason, you know, my reason for bringing that up is clinical placements are really complicated when it comes to kind of negotiating between an EPP and a district, and it seems like there are tons of teachers out there who are eligible, but you have to balance that against the number of teachers who teach a subject that we don't have a student teacher for, right? Or that cooperating teacher is already asked to be a department chair, and so that number then kind of dwindles, so it becomes challenging. So I think it would be great for us to have some guidelines, some recommendations about what clinical placement should look like, how EPPs should be using this data with LEAs. I would caution us a little bit about kind of hard and fast rules about who we should place with.
So I'm going to concur with that, because I think where we've gotten in trouble as policymakers in the past is trying to say that a teacher has to be accomplished or distinguished in all of the evaluation standards, when that's a growth model, right? I'm sorry. I said I think we have to be careful about the hard and fast rules, as Michael was just saying, because in the past we've gotten in trouble as policymakers by stating that a teacher has to be accomplished and distinguished in all standards, when this is the evaluation model is a growth model. And it may be that I have a teacher that's qualified to be a mentor from the instructional side of the house and from the leadership side of the house, but yet I've put them in a different content area because they're licensed in that. And I've done that. Well, they might be proficient in a particular standard and accomplished in another one. That does not mean that they're not a highly effective teacher. If I'm utilizing the instrument with fidelity as a growth model, then I'm not overinflating just so that I can meet some requirement, so that I can assign as a mentor or a cooperating teacher. Does that make sense? So I do think, going back to some of the comments here, that this is a good study for folks to look at from an EPP perspective. But as policymakers, we have to be careful that we don't say it's just black and white, right? Because there are many different teachers in this state, and many different standards, and we just have to be careful about that.
Well, I think a different way of thinking about that is change for inquiry and intrinsic sake versus change for compliance sake.
Right.
I think you all or another body could make things be a requirement, and EPPs and school districts can check some boxes. But one of my earlier slides was about the policy or practice implications. I think there are more practice implications, and it sort of is a motivator, hopefully, for EPPs and districts to intrinsically want to make sure that they're leveraging the data that's out there to make these better placements, to better connect to that early career period. And perhaps you're going to see more growth anyway out of an intrinsic push to do that than in a compliance-based approach to do that.
And then I'd say from an LEA perspective, we would like EPPs to look at maybe widening that placement zone for student teachers, right? And that's difficult too, because you got to take into consideration the student teacher, and staffing at the university level for assigning the coaches that come out and work from the university. But if we're going to truly address some of these issues, then we've got to have a much broader, playing field for placement, student teacher placement. It can't just be in this zone or this region, because it's the distance to travel.
I just wanted to comment on that. That was something that we have discussed. Something that we've kind of discussed in our GTAC meetings, talking about possibly creating an embedding system where you take a student teacher and you embed them in a community, and have a family that, like you're doing a study abroad, you're doing a study across the county, across the state, but you would have a host family, you would stay there, you would really become entrenched in their community. And hopefully fall in love with that community, that rural community, or wherever, and possibly stay there. During the data and everything, I think data is great, but when I look at your takeaways, I can simplify it in one word: relationships. The success of a student teacher lies in the relationships that are built during that student teaching process. High quality learning environments matter, but it's also the fact that, I'm speaking from personal experience. I was in a rural community and did a student teaching experience, but I felt very blessed. I did not just have that one teacher take me under her wing. The whole grade level did. the whole school, entrenched me in meetings and inviting me to functions and things like that. So I think that LEAs, would really do well by using that format, by really bringing those student teachers in and making them feel a part of the community, and not just relying on that one clinical teacher that's going to be doing the student teaching with her or him. And then that will make them want to stay. We're wanting we want to retain good teachers, and so it's all about relationships, in my estimation.
And I agree. I mean, much of a high quality learning environment is like teacher collaboration. Again, part of what's driving, high levels of student growth are, relationships going on in schools.
Other questions or comments?
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bastian. We appreciate your time and expertise. So I would now like to recognize the 2017-18 Teacher of the Year, Mrs. Lisa Godwin, as today is her last meeting with us on Pepsi. And on behalf of the commission, I'd like to thank you for your year of service with us. We have appreciated your contributions, your insight, and your wisdom. And as a token of our appreciation, I have a certificate to present you with.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciated it. Thank you for letting me be a part of the narrative and hopefully make a difference. Thank you.
And so as Mrs. Godwin leaves us, we'd like to welcome the 2018-19 Teacher of the Year, Mr. Freebird McKinney. And Mr. McKinney comes to us, comes to Pepsi with 14 years of teaching experience in Alamance Burlington School District, and I think you're at Williams High School right now. He's a social studies teacher, and he has developed the Student Leadership Academy to better connect his students and help them become more civically engaged. He also serves as adjunct professor at Elon University. Well played, Dr. Bullock. And has taught at Grimsley High School in Greensboro and Eastern Guilford High School. So we welcome you to Pepsi, Mr. McKinney, and look forward to working with you next year. So there's no further business on the agenda, so thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for today's discussions. I'd like to remind commission members that our next standing meeting will be held in this room on Thursday, September the 13th, from 9 to 12. We have now completed our meeting, and unless there's additional business, I ask for a motion to adjourn.
I will make that motion as my last form of Pepsi business.
Thank you, Ms. Godwin. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second to adjourn. There's no discussion. All in favor of adjournment, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.